Rehan, thank you so much. So many people for coming. We have a big crowd in the room, and I bet we have a big crowd on Zoom. I'm delighted to be introducing Sandra Rehan this afternoon. We discovered her because she just became a member of the Royal Society of Canada. And the co-chair, Linda Hutchin of the committee, went through all the people who just were inducted into the Royal and identified those who live in Toronto. And voila, here is Sandra, who runs a bee lab at York, where she's an associate professor in biology. So her website tells you that they have a special interest in the origin and maintenance of social behavior in bees. And she has traveled all over the world because each continent's bees are different. I learned over lunch to study the social behavior of bees using a fascinating combination of field observations to learn the natural history and ecology, and lab experiments to investigate behavioral plasticity. And they do genomic work, behavioral work. They use all kinds of tools in order to answer these questions. She has lots of publications. On her website are 14 from 2019 and 20 alone. And they are in journals ranging from insects to biodiversity and conservation, forest ecosystems, proceedings of the Royal Society, etc. She has a huge number of awards. They were printed in the announcement of this talk, so I'm not going to repeat them. Just remember, she has a huge number of awards, but I'm going to give her time to talk about diversity decline and sustainability of wild bees. Sandra.
It seems to have moved. Great. Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm pleased to be here. I recently moved back to Toronto from living outside of the country for 12 years. So it's a very good time to be back in Canada. So yeah, I'm at York University in biology. And today I'll share with you my work on the diversity, decline, and sustainability of wild bees. And interestingly, that's only half of my research program. We have a whole other half in behavioral genetics I won't really talk about today. So whenever I talk to folks about bees, everyone asks me, where do you keep your hives? Do you have honey? How are the honeybees doing? And I'm always quick to point out that
I'm just getting rid of
that.
That's a little black annoyance. Maybe I'm getting rid of it. I'm moving it.
Can you hit the negative?
Yeah, I already did. Okay,
That's good. Yeah,
I'm taking it off the screen.
that works. Thank you. So everyone asks me how the honeybees are doing and where do I keep my honeybees? And I always have to explain I don't actually work on honeybees. Well, honeybees are the most well-known bee and beloved by many. They do in fact make honey. They were actually brought over to North America about 200 years ago by European settlers. And so they're a non-native domesticated animal. And while initially brought over for honey and wax production, have since been mass produced for agriculture. And while very vital to our economy, they aren't actually native wildlife. And so instead of studying honeybees, I study the wild bee community. And so honeybees are one species globally. They're native to the old world, Africa, Europe, and Asia, but they're non-native in North America and in the New World. I study wild bees. There's over 20,000 species worldwide, 4,000 here in North America, and at least 400 here in Southern Ontario. And so there's all this diversity and complexity that people don't really know much about, but their biodiversity is their strength. They've co-evolved with our native wildflowers, and ecologies are very important and well adapted to our food production. And so while they're relatively understudied, they're tremendously important. And so today I'll share with you a little bit about some of these bees. Obviously, I can't talk about all of them today, but I'll share an overview of some of the wild bees you can find here in your backyards and green roofs and are very common in Toronto and Southern Ontario. So first off, I'd like to introduce the sweat bees. These get their name because they'll actually drink of human sweat. So bees, like most insects, are salt limited. So researchers have noticed them landing on their arms and things. And so that's how they got their name. And they're beautiful bees ranging from metallic blue and green, copper and gold coloration. And they're very common and you'll find them readily. If you knew this was a bee moving forward this spring, you'll now know that's in fact a bee and not a fly landing on you. And so here's just some of the diversity. Here's an Aegochloropsis species, again, showcasing some of the metallic blue-green colorations. Here's a very common bee locally, Halictus ligatus. They're tremendous pollinators, as you can see, and these are a social bee. And so bees are mostly solitary, 75% are solitary, so a single mom doing all foraging and reproducing by herself. Whereas social bees in this groups, unlike honeybees, don't really have decided queens and workers, but often have kind of more communal group living and smaller groups. And so unlike a honeybee hive where you're going to have hundreds of thousands of individuals, these societies usually have maybe 10 or 20 individuals working together in groups. And bees are so beloved. Actually, the city of Toronto world over is really a champion for bee conservation research insofar as they have their own bee. And so this is the bee of Toronto. It's called Agapostum invarescens, the bicolor sweat bee. They're metallic blue-green in the head and thorax and black and yellow in the abdomen. They're very distinctive. And they're, in fact, our work here in Toronto has shown they're very common. They're very most common bee we're finding in the city, comprising upwards of 25% of our wild bee collections. So this is a bee that lives communally. They make one nest entrance, and dozens of individuals will share one entrance, living in little branches beneath the soil. And so they kind of call that condo living. And so it's very apropos of Toronto. And so they're a very cooperative bee and used to living in close densities. And so this is the bee of Toronto. And you'll see there's even some murals painted in the city of this bee. And so also to note is most bees actually live beneath the ground. 75% are ground nesting. And here's another common bee, Halictus confusus, a duller metallic green bee. It lives socially. You can see the one female outside of the nest and some pollen residue at the nest entrance. But if you look closely, you can see the antenna of one of her sisters inside of the nest waiting for her to return. And so the bees live beneath the soil. And so this availability of bare soil is vital for bee habitat. And unfortunately, some of the negative consequences of urbanization is we're losing bare ground for bees to live. So when we have gardens, we really advocate, don't mulch them over, don't cover them, because they need this exposure to this bare ground, bare soil to live beneath. And that's becoming a limiting resource. So I've spent many years actually excavating these nests. It's quite fun. I used to be a little bit more bendy, but I can still do it. And so you can actually dig the tunnels beneath the soil. They range about 15 to 30 centimeters beneath the ground. They get deeper as the season progresses, and they actually overwinter, usually around 50 centimeters beneath the soil. Here you can see the tunnel, and then these little pockets are pollen balls. They're brood cells where females will collect pollen and make a pollen ball. So wild bees don't make honey. They just collect pollen and nectar in crude form and feed it to their offspring outright. So here's some of the examples. So in the top right, you can see a pollen ball with an egg laid on it. So this pollen ball is about a day's work for a mom. And that's the total food that egg will get to develop into an adult. So understanding the pollen composition from within these nests is vitally important. You can see they're relatively small, as seen in the hand there. And then the cartoon to the left, you can see the architecture of some of these nests, where you can see development from larvae through pupal and adult stages. So there's a lot of natural history to be discovered. Most bees have not been studied. We don't know anything of their nest architecture or pollen use. And so there's many open questions. But anyway, these are very common bees. So next time you're in a park or garden or green space, keep an eye out. They make these kind of round entrance hole about the size of a pencil, and often with little dirt pellets around. And so, yeah, these metallic green things are actually bees. And so they're very common in the city of Toronto and widespread in North America. The next bee I wanted to talk about is the leafcutter bee. They get their names because of their habit of cutting leaves. And so if you see these perfectly round discs cut out of leaves, that's not the work of caterpillars. It's actually a bee that's doing that. And so they take these discs of leaves back to the nest, and they line their nest using this material. And these bees are remarkably good pollinators. You can see they're very densely hairy, and so much so that they're even becoming a managed bee in some parts, really good for things like alfalfa and other crops. And so there is a rising industry in leafcutter bees being developed as an alternative to honeybees. We also have a rise of invasive species. This is a bee that came over from Asia called Megachile xylocopoides. It's about the size of your thumb. It's a massive bee, and it mimics the large carpenter bee. And so it'll actually live in these cavities and is displacing some of our native wildlife. And so bees can range in size tremendously. This is on the very upper end of how big bees can get. But they're just beautiful and remarkable. Each has their own name and history and habits. This is a male of the Megachile latimanus. I love this bee. It's a local native bee. Its fuzzy legs, they actually use those to cover the female's antenna during mating. It's part of their sexual selection. And they're just fascinating once you understand these bees and their varieties of kinds. Again, too many for me to talk about today. They live in stems, and so you'll see them commonly in bee hotels or bamboo stakes. If you do any gardening and the bamboos are left, those little holes are often occupied by bees. Here you can see a female returning to her nest with her abdomen protruding. And then in the upper right, you can see a female guarding her nest with her face poking out of the nest entrance. So if you have a bee hotel, it often looks like this. Or if you have any kind of skewers or stakes, keep an eye out for these entrance holes. They're often really nice nesting habitats. And here's a cross section of a Megachile nest. Here you can see how they use the leaves to line the nest. A lot of these leaves provide really great antifungal properties and provide a lot of resilience to the nest. And you can see also the brood cells are being provisioned in a serial manner. You can see a little cap between each with leaves. And so they're really easy to do accounting because it's a linear nest. We can look at the investment mothers are making and how it varies in different ecologies and over time. The next close relative are the trap nesting bees. They're in the same family, Megachilidae, but this is the genus Osmia. They're also wonderful pollinators, again, turning into more commercial production. A lot of these are used for almond and other crops as well, blue orchard bees. And so here you can see a female with her stinger out, but what's most noticeable about this photo is you can see the tremendous wing wear she's accumulated. So bees are born with pristine wing margins, and as they forage, they actually develop nicks and tears on the edge of their wings. And so you can actually track that in the wild and through museum collections to look at the foraging effort, proxy for age and how hard these bees are having to work to find food in the environment. Anyway, they're just beautiful bees. And so I thought I'd just tell you a little bit about Osmia. They're certainly a bee to keep an eye out for, very common, because again, they're a trap nesting bee. Unlike the megachilid bees, these live in more crevices, rocks. You sometimes see little YouTube clips go viral, bee living between bricks and things like that. That's these Osmia bees. So it may be a surprise to some folks to tell you that these bees actually can even live in snail shells. So they'll take whatever kind of cavity they can occupy. This is a British bee, Osmia bicornifrons. It's got the very distinctive orange abdomen. And so they'll find snail shells, but that's also found here. I found them, Osmia conjuncta, a blue variety, living in snail shells down in Niagara. So when you take these snail shells, you can cut them open and you can see they're actually depositing pollen and nectar and eggs inside of these nests. Obviously, it's a very finite space. They can only put 2 or 3 offspring in any given snail shell, but they'll kind of spread their investment across the landscape and reusing these kind of resources in a very fascinating way. They line their nest with found materials like rocks and sand to block up the nest entrance to protect them from predators like ants, who would really love to eat the larvae and pollen if they could gain access. But the bees can push their way through and emerge and forage. These are solitary bees, and so they never interact with the mom. The offspring are born and never see another conspecific except for mating. Some of my favorite bees are the carpenter bees. As I mentioned, the large carpenter bee is the largest bee we have locally, again, the size of your thumb, but they also have a small cousin, the small carpenter bee. And that's the bee I actually study the most. They're tiny little things about the size of your pinky nail. And they range about 5 to 10 millimeters total body length. And they live in raspberry, rose, and sumac stems inside the hollow pith of those stems. So if you have any gardens, if you prune back those stems, it's a perfect nesting habitat. They're also very common in sumac trees, which are very abundant here locally. So this is the small carpenter bee. She's the major focus of my research program. The other half of my research program I won't talk about today is in behavioral genetics. So I spent the last decade developing genomes, methylomes, transcriptomes, doing a lot of work in early childhood development and maternal care. These bees are wonderful mothers. They produce very few offspring, but invest in them heavily. And so they only produce 5 to 10 offspring in their lifetime, but interact with them through development and even into adulthood. And that's very unusual, much more bird and mammal-like and not like other insects. So here are some of the nesting of carpenter bees. You'll see these in hardwood timbers, and they're thought to be a pest because of some of the structural damages they can create, but they don't typically extend their nests very far in any given year. So if you see a large carpenter bee, they're not of great concern. But colleagues of mine study these, and you can take down these fascia and structures if people give you access, and they again collect the pollen, feed it to their larvae outright, and we can raise them up in the lab or study them in the field. And there's a great diversity of kinds. Historically, these bees lived in trees, not in hardwoods. And so when we do work in Africa and other continents, you'll find them actually living in the trees where they used to. It's more of a recent switch to living in man-made timbers. And here at the bottom, you can see a small carpenter bee nest, a cross section, and inside of a raspberry cane. It's a perfectly linear burrow. They just scrape the inside of the nest to make these brood cell partitions. And again, the females will actually break down these partitions every evening, groom their offspring, remove any fecal pellets, fungi, dead cells, rebuild the partition. So they're heavily invested in relatively few offspring. Another bee of note are the cuckoo bees. So much like you might know the cuckoo birds who lay their eggs in other birds' nests, bees do this also. And the cuckoo bees are interesting because they typically are kind of a red-orange in coloration. And bees, interestingly, don't really see into the red spectrum. So they think that's actually a bit of sneaky camouflage. They also chemically tend to mimic their host, but also visually they may be hiding. So here's one, the genus Phacodes. These are closely related to the sweat bees. And a lot of times they'll have a specific host species they attack, but oftentimes they may attack a variety of species. So they're varied in their biology. Here's an Omata species. It's more closely related to the small carpenter bees. And again, they're varied in their biology and they're very difficult to identify. Here's some more photos of them to show. They're pretty rare to see because they're parasites on the hosts, but these range from a wide variety of host species. And here's just some more of their morphology and interest. So they're a very difficult group to study. So one of my students right now is doing her PhD revising the taxonomy of this group, because currently people really have given up on trying to tell species apart. And so it's so vital to understanding their ecology that that's her life's work. Her PhD will only be a small part. And last but not least, I wanted to mention the bumblebees. Outside of honeybees, this tends to be the one bee people know and love. They're large, they're black and yellow, they're fuzzy, they're kind of the charismatic group of bees. And so bumblebees are the best studied bee outside of honeybee. And bumblebees are very important because they provide a unique buzz pollination. And so a lot of bees can't provide the sonication to release pollen. And so this is a bumblebee on a blueberry. Here it is also on a tomato. So these crops are vital for buzz pollination. And so people will actually bring in bumblebees to allow the proper pollination of these crops. And bumblebees are part of a group called the corbiculate bees, closely related to the honeybee. But you can see on their hind leg, they have this shiny basket-like substrate, and around it, there's dense hairs, allowing them to collect large volumes of pollen. So that's why they get the name the corbiculate, because that structure is called the corbicula. And bumblebees vary in morphology and coloration, often are identified based on the color or banding on their abdomen. And so they're often black and yellow, but sometimes even orange in coloration. And here's a very famous, unfortunately famous bee, the rusty patch bumblebee. Used to be very common in these parts, but hasn't been seen locally in over 20 years. So this was the first bee species listed as an endangered species, and has since been locally extinct. Still remnant populations in Minnesota and Wisconsin, but very, very rare. And bumblebees are one of these social bees, and so they live in colonies of hundreds of individuals. They have queens and workers, and they live in these kind of pot-like structures. And so you can actually buy these colonies commercially for agriculture, but also a lot of researchers tend to study bumblebees because you can easily house them in the lab. So that's just a few stories. Obviously, I couldn't tell you all of their stories today, but I just wanted to give you an appreciation about the diversity of bees here locally, and to encourage you to learn more about wild bees. And so wild bees are important not just because they're beautiful and diverse, but we rely on them so heavily. Famously, it was quoted that every third mouth of food we eat is dependent on unmanaged pollination services of bees. So the emphasis there on unmanaged. So it's not the honeybees that are actually doing most of the work. Studies have shown 80% of our pollination services come from unmanaged wild pollinators, including our native bees. And so this is a famous photograph taken by Claire Cremens. On the left, you can see a supermarket with all the variety of fruits and vegetables we enjoy. And on the right is a supermarket without bees. And so we're going to lose most of our fruit and veg varieties. All that would be left is really a few nuts and citrus. And so we need the bees a whole lot more than they need us. And so moving forward for food security, wild bee conservation is of utmost importance. But sadly, we also know that bees are declining. And so about 15 years ago, this really became public knowledge when a lot of the work spearheaded out of the UK and the Netherlands showcased the decline of wild bees. Subsequently, about 10 years ago, the similar work was being done in North America. So it's a global problem. Wild bees are just declining and disappearing at a rapid rate. Here's a very famous study done in the Northeast, showing historically, hundreds of bee species and over 200 years studying museum collections. We're showing 25 to 30% of our wild bee diversity lost. Alongside that, bumblebees are kind of a really well characterized fauna, and we're seeing 30% losses in the bumblebee communities as well. Alongside this, we see a rise in wild bee from alien invasions. So some of these, historically, there's only one species, the European introduced honeybee, but over the years, there's been more and more coming in through commercial trade, some misguided attempts at introducing non-native pollinators for agriculture anyway. And so as these species are coming into the country, they're also bringing a lot of parasites, pathogens, and we don't really know how they're offsetting our local ecology. So when we talk about bee declines, it's kind of a fourfold issue, the biggest of which is probably land use. We know as agriculture has expanded dramatically in the last 60 years, this has had tremendous effects with changes of land use, the rise of pesticides, habitat loss, fragmentation of landscapes, but also the recent rise of urbanization. Currently, about half of the world's population lives in cities. By 2050, they think it's going to be 3/4. So urbanization's on the rise. Just look to our own local development woes, and you'll see kind of what is the fate for wildlife in these circumstances. Another major variable is climate change. We know climates are changing and severe weather and unpredictability. Thankfully, we don't live in California right now, but we can see the kind of things that are happening globally, and it's becoming all too frequent. And with this unpredictability of seasonality and temperature extremes, we're seeing a lot of spatial and phenological mismatch. So if we can't predict the weather, what hopes does the bee and the flower have to kind of link up in time? Alongside this, we have a lot of alien species. As I mentioned, a lot of non-native bees are coming in from other continents. But alongside that, we're also getting parasites, pathogens, and non-native flowers. So there's a lot of trade in ornamental plants, but also alien introductions of a lot of weedy varieties that take over. And so it's really changing the ecology. There's a lot of work to try to conserve and offset this, but we're still documenting every year new species coming in, and with really no idea of what the implications might be. And last but not least is parasites and pathogens. As I mentioned, a lot of these non-native species carry over novel pathogens and parasites, but also with the rise of honeybee keeping, they're a domesticated product, often mismanaged. And so with the rise of honeybee crowding, we have a lot of disease, the rise of varroa mites, nosema, various viruses. And well, that's terrible for the honeybee trade, but it's also spilling over into the wild bee community. So much like we have buses and trains and subways as hubs of our disease transmission, bees have wildflowers. And so as the honeybee population rises, they're saturating the landscape, and the disease transmission is on the rise. And we're seeing increasing disease now into the wild bee community as well. So as it's complicated, each factor is not acting in isolation. Unfortunately, they're also acting in concert. So it's a pretty difficult thing to study, but we're doing our best to try to at least assess all of these variables at the same time. So that's kind of a general introduction as to the problem, and here's what we're trying to do about it. So my lab kind of focuses on understanding biodiversity. It always surprises me every time I move to a new location how little is known about the wild bees locally, and also their food sources, basic questions. Also documenting decline, and then hopefully ending on a happier note, talking about some of the wins of conservation and sustainability moving forward. So to start off, talk about some of the diversity. So for a number of years, I was in New Hampshire and we studied wild bees there, capturing 118 species. Again, documenting 7 introduced species in my short time there, but also many new state records. And so even if a bee is native, there's a lot of range shifts happening due to climate change. And so we're seeing a lot of shifts in the ecology of bees. Part of our work is not just documenting the bees, but also their natural habits. So we do these things called plant pollinator networks. And so all of the plant species are on the left in green, and all the bees are on the right in blue. And then their interconnectedness are these black lines. The width of the bars is their prevalence in the population, and the width of the connectivity, these yellow bars, are particularly strong associations. So in this case, we documented 34 flower species and 63 bee species, providing us 197 unique interactions. In addition to just documenting the interactions of these individuals, we can also look at the phenology, and we see that the plants are around for different periods. Some plants are only in bloom for 2 weeks of the year, others are around for months on end. And the seasonality and the specificity of this is pretty important if we want to provide flower diversity year-round for bees. Likewise, the bees are varied in their natural habits. Some are only around for a few weeks of the year, others are around for months on end. So understanding these relationships is vital to getting their ecologies right. One very common bee is the bumblebee, Bombus impatiens. It's actually called the common eastern bumblebee because it's so prevalent. And so it's around year round because it's got queens and workers and males, large colony sizes, and it's around for pretty much the entire foraging season. Another really common bee is the bee I mentioned earlier, Halictus legatus. Again, a social bee where you have the queens and workers around season long. But you can see there's various bees that are also only around for a few weeks of the year. So a lot of understanding their natural history is vital to understanding their needs. The plant species we capture in high abundance early season, we were just talking about these clovers. They're actually a superfood for bees. We've done nutritional studies. Bees raised on clover grow faster, survive better than some other varieties. Interestingly, clover is not a native species, but it is really important given its prevalence in green spaces, agriculture, crop cover, urban landscapes. It really takes well, and if allowed to bloom, provides really useful foraging resources for bees. So this idea of not mowing in May when bees need this food, it's one of the few food sources available to bees. And so various municipalities like Toronto have introduced these no mow May kind of phenomenon to try to offset this over pruning and mowing and cleaning, pristining, so that we can actually allow food to grow and allow wildlife to coexist. Another really important plant variety are the goldenrod. We see these in late season, September into October, when there's relatively few other plants available. Unfortunately, they get mistaken for ragweed and other things that are not so lovely. So there's a habit of removing them from the landscape when they're a vital pollen source for many bees. Another controversial species is the dandelion, again, not native. Most people don't like them, but they're, again, only around for a few weeks of the year and are a pretty vital food source. They're not a superfood, but it's better to have some food than nothing at that time of year. And lastly, the interesting finds we get, some of these plants are only in bloom for very short periods, but are highly visited. Here, the raspberry is only in bloom for 2 weeks of the year, but visited by more diversity of bees than any other plant we surveyed. So we're learning a lot of this for the first time and just doing these studies and understanding what the bees' needs are, what is their nutritional requirements, what are their preferences, all very basic questions yet to be asked and answered. So that's just a few stories. Of course, there's a ton of data in these networks, and we publish these lists to make it available for scientists, but also very useful for people like master gardeners and conservation groups to know what flowers are actually visited by bees. So the take home from this work is really the importance of these early spring and late fall kind of varieties. During the spring and summer, June, July, there's a great diversity of plants available. We're not so worried about those periods, but in early May and late September, there's really relatively little plants available. So if we can give clover and goldenrod and things like this a chance, there's should be great fitness benefits for bees as they're just getting going for the year, or as they're winding down for overwintering. And as I mentioned, we do a lot of work in natural history. So it's not just understanding where the bees visit, but what food are they bringing back to the nest. So by our unique kind of approach studying the natural history, we can actually look at the pollen balls themselves and look at the diversity of pollens they're bringing back. Sometimes visitation can be misunderstood as preference or diet. If we study the pollen ball, there's no mistaking that. And so we can study the ground nesting, stem nesting, and trap nesting bees in this capacity to really get a very clear sense of what they're eating and what they need to survive. So we take multiple approaches. We can look at them using traditional morphological approaches. You can stain pollen grains, the whole field of palynology. Very time consuming, but very accurate. We can get to species level resolution in many cases because pollen is just a fascinating thing. Of course, it's very time consuming and inefficient if we're going to do this at scale. So we've now also turned to molecular approaches where we can crush up the pollen balls and look at the DNA diversity, and not just look at plant diversity, but we can look at all kinds of different variables, including the microbiome and environmental DNA using these approaches. So here's a study we did using traditional palynology, where we were able to document some of the diversity in these small carpenter bees in their nests. This is a generalist bee, so they forage on a wide variety of pollens. So they have over 100 known host plants through these pollen collections. But interestingly, 2 or 3 species of pollen comprise 80 to 90% of their diet. So just because they're observed sampling wide variety of pollens, they still have preference, they still have dietary needs. So documenting this for not just one species, but for many is vital if we want to provide the right flowers for them. Moreover, we can use these molecular approaches to not only look at the pollen at the plants at the top, but also the co-occurrence of bacteria on the bottom. And so bees have a microbiome much like ourselves. They benefit from things like probiotics. So just as we eat things like yogurt and cheese to gain our lactobacillus is vital for bees as well. It helps with their digestion, immunity, development, and survival. So we can see what flowers are good hubs and sources of lactobacillus, because a lot of these flowers are actually providing a lot of these probiotics for bees as well. And so we do a lot of these studies in a comparative context. For years, I was in New Hampshire characterizing those populations, but then we also wanted to look across species ranges, look to Missouri and as well as Georgia, very different climatic areas, different local abundances of flowers. And so by using molecular tools, we could characterize the pollen used in these regions. And we see that while they use a wide range of pollen, each region has its own preference. And so it's important to not just try to extrapolate a species based on a single population or region. They will vary regionally as well. And so there's a need to do these kind of comparative studies. I also studied extensively in Australia, where I did my PhD research. And so I had the good fortune of being able to study bees across Queensland, Victoria, and South Australia. Again, here a small carpenter bee. And we found that in Queensland, it's actually a tropical area. Victoria's grassland, South Australia is more temperate. We see that in the Queensland tropical area, we have very high plant diversity. And alongside that, interestingly, we find very high fungal and bacterial diversity in the pollen ball. When we look at the Australians really characterize their biodiversity very well. And so we can correlate this back to the known just standing biodiversity in these regions. And so they're being very affected by what's available in the landscape. Comparatively, South Australia and Victoria have a much reduced pollen diversity, but interestingly, that's also affecting their microbiome. And so our comparative studies aren't just across locations, but within a region, there's also a great deal of heterogeneity. I had the good fortune when in New Hampshire to work with both forestry and agricultural partners. So we could study things like organic versus conventional farming. What's the effect of pesticides on the landscape? looking at traditional meadows and pastures, looking at how forestry and silvopasture, where you can leave only 30% of the canopy cover versus clear cutting when it's completely removed. What effects does this have on the bee community, all within a pretty narrow region? And so we overall find that as management increases, as land is either sprayed with pesticides or cleared of trees, there's a net negative effect on bees, not surprisingly. But there is somewhat of a sweet spot in between where organic farming and silvopasture actually had the highest diversity of bees, providing this heterogeneity of landscape, a lot of edges, a lot of broken stems, and it actually was a net benefit for bees. And so we can coexist with bees. We just need to learn how to not overmanage, but a little bit of management is okay. And they were actually doing better than some of these more naturalized sites. So I won't get into it in much detail, but we do use a phylogenetic approach to try to understand land use management. Insofar as I've shared the biodiversity of bees, these different kinds, if there's landscapes where trap nesting bees and leafcutter bees are completely absent, or ground nesting bees are completely absent, there's strong implications for the kind of future proofing these landscapes by maintaining that biodiversity. So we use this approach to really understand regional fauna where it's absent and to try to prioritize conservation in this way. In doing so, we can pick out species that are found in regions indicative of certain landscapes. And so when they're missing, kind of to allow us to have early indications of landscapes in concern. And so I didn't really talk about the Andrena bee, but they're another ground nesting bee. Lasia glossum are some of these ground nesting sweat bees, and the bumblebee, of course, is well known. And so by these studies being able to understand what's there naturally will allow us to understand when something's missing, when we need to act. And so with this, this moves us into our understanding of bee declines, right? We need to know the bees around us in order to appreciate when they're no longer doing well. So as I mentioned, the bumblebees are probably the best studied bee. Historically, they're also some of the best collected bees. There's a lot of new methods nowadays to collect bees using different technologies, but historically, every naturalist was just collecting a bee with a net. And so these bees were easy to see and easy to collect and really well studied. So they're really well preserved in historic archives. And so they have received most conservation notice. There's 4 species in the Wildlife Action Plan. This is through the US Fish and Wildlife. The rusty patch bumblebee, as I mentioned, is an endangered species. There's other species like Bombus pennsylvanicus, Furvidus, and Tricola that are of great concern. So we set forth to kind of characterize this, to contribute to this conservation assessment using museum collections. And I was lucky to work in a university that had a very old and very excellent insect collection. Over 3 or 4 years, we digitized every specimen in the collection and were able to characterize 150 years of change in the bee community. No single scientist or naturalist lives that long, however, so you can see it's kind of spotty in collections. There's certain years of really high collections and others of less so. So we have to control for that in assessing this. So we tend to, rather than just looking at sheer abundance of bees, we try to take a relative measure, understanding that it's going to be a spotty collection and that we need to adjust. So using museums is tremendously helpful. Trying to statistically control for some of the noise. We can characterize really high prevalence years, low years, first and last records of key species, but also look at how major climate events might be affecting bees, and more pressingly, how is human activity affecting bees? We know the terrible things DDT did to the environment, but more recently, we're also beginning to see the effects of neonicotinoids. So interestingly, as neonicotinoids began to be used in the early 90s, that coincided right alongside the last records for many of our endangered and locally extinct species. Probably no coincidence. So I'm very proud of this study. So fully female cast led by an undergraduate in my group. And it's really characterizing this work, publishing the records of these bees for use for US Fish and Wildlife, but conservation work moving forward. And so we were able to document these declining species, reaffirming their need for conservation status, agreeing with former studies showing Bombus affinis, Furvidus, and Terricola are in fact declining, but also highlighting Bombus vagans, a species that wasn't really being considered by many groups as one of potential concern to keep an eye out for. It's not all fire and brimstone, though. People tend to talk about the things that are disappearing. There are some bees that are doing okay. So if we look at Bombus bimaculatus and Patiens and Trinarius, they're actually on the rise. So understanding these stable and increasing species is just as important as understanding the ones that are disappearing. What are they? What is their physiology? How are they coping with ever-changing environments? And how can we use them to improve conservation moving forward? So some of our records, we've been able to show kind of the significant range shifts of these bees. This is just for Bombus terricola in the state of New Hampshire. Historically, it was widespread from all the way across the state, a wide elevational gradient from seacoast up to the mountains. And then we can see in recent years, in blue, it's really contracted its range just to the White Mountain range, formerly at sea level, now only found at high elevation refugia. And we think this is attributable to climate change. No longer found at the northern edges where it's low elevation. And we see a net over 500-meter kind of shift in an elevation. So it's of concern because they're there now, but they kind of have limited room to move or grow. So we've talked about the bumblebees, but there's all these other wild bees I was telling you about. So my student, Minna Mathiasen, did her work looking at all the other bees in the collection nobody usually talks about. So she was able to get good data for 119 wild bee species over 125 years. And I identified 16 more bee species in decline, unfortunately, outside of the bumblebee community. These range from Andrena, Nomata, some of the sweat bees, and the megachilid bees. So wide ranging, not just a certain genus or group, but a wide range of wild bees in general. And a particular concern are these Nomata, the cuckoo bees, as I mentioned, because they are known to be so tied to their host, they may be an early indicator of the host population also not doing well. So we're really developing a lot of tools around the cuckoo bee as kind of an indicator species to understanding wild bee ecology more broadly. From Minna's work, we were also able to try to go beyond just documenting declines, but try to understand kind of what might be driving these declines using our plant pollinator network framework. And so here's a pollinator network over a 125-year period where you have, again, plants on the left and the bees on the right. Maintained relationships are in black, total loss of relationships are in red, and relationships where the bee or the flower is still present, just no longer associated, is in blue. So most concern is really these red lines where we see neither the bee nor the plant locally. They've become locally extirpated. And we can relay this back to Minna's work. Previously, a lot of these species are known to be declining, so maybe not surprising, we're not getting good floral associations with them either. And then when we look to the historic records for the plants, a lot of these plant species have become endangered and locally extinct. The bee's relationship with these plants is so tight and so specific that when the plant is no longer available, it's probably not so surprising that the bees then also go locally extinct. Many of these plant species are pretty rare and a lot of alpine varieties. So our hope is that if we could reintroduce these plant species, perhaps there might be a chance for these bees to also return to the populations. So that would be a very kind of depressing way to end a talk. So I thought I'd talk also about sustainability. Some of the work that we're doing to looking at conservation land and what we can do moving forward. And so the big question is really, is conservation land helping bees? There's surprisingly little work done in areas that are protected. So we set forth and did this work in the White Mountain National Forest. Normally you can't do research in these areas because they're protected, but the National Forest Service gave us special permission because they were very fascinated to know what bees lived in that region. So it's a huge area. If you've never been, I highly encourage you to visit year round. There's something to do there. And the huge elevational gradient. So this work is not just about the science itself, but it's also an opportunity to do a lot of science outreach and science communication. So in these events, we do what we call the BioBlitz events. I don't know if you've heard of these, where you can bring people together from all walks of life. We have families, school groups, conservationists, universities, master gardeners, you name it, came. The event drew 50 people from 5 different states, and we were able to come together. I give public lectures on wild bees. They learn bee diversity and flower identification, and they also help us over 2 or 3 days collect pretty intensively across the landscape. This work is not only useful for outreach, but we can actually publish on these results, not only contributing to the science and the archives, but also contributing this data back to the Forest Service, who are so desperate for any of these kind of basic information. So here's the work we've done. The bottom, you can see the area we covered in the White Mountain National Forest in Mount Washington region. And this is kind of the northern edge of New Hampshire, where we were located next to the university here, is with the little asterisks on the map. Interestingly, our studies in the low elevation university region, we'd sample all year round, a smaller team, of course, only 2 or 3 researchers, collecting about 2,297 specimens and about 118 species. But when one weekend with this large community science effort, we were able to collect 1,010 individuals and 137 species. So dramatic contributions these kind of events can make. Interestingly, we were really trying to figure out conservation status, and at the time we only had information on the bumblebees. We did find the Bombus fervidus, only a single specimen, but it was encouraging to see that it at least does live there. Bombus terricola, however, we found 73 specimens comprising 40% of the bumblebee community and 7% of all bees in total, where it's relatively rare and uncommon in other parts. It seems to be doing very well up in the White Mountains. So it is surviving and maybe even thriving there. The future of that bee is hard to say, but at least there is a stable population for now. But also what I find very interesting is our work at the seacoast. We'll find 118 species, high elevation, 137 species, but the intersection is actually pretty slight. We only had 64 species found in both regions, just kind of further echoing the need for this regional approach where we need surveys across multiple habitats and landscapes because the wild bee diversity is so great and habitat requirements are so varied. So since moving from New Hampshire, I'm now here in Toronto. And so we've really embraced our local environment. And so we turned to doing a lot of work in urban ecology as well. And so the great thing of being in Toronto, the city truly cares. And there's a ton of great NGOs here that are heavily invested in bees. And so we were working with the City of Toronto, David Suzuki Foundation, World Wildlife Federation, and Pollinator Partnership, among others, to really work with these kind of programs they have going on. You may have heard of Pollinate TO and some of these other programs where they're providing funding for pollinator gardens. They mean well. They know native flowers and no pesticides are good, but there's not a lot of information about what bees actually visit these flowers or what bees need. And so we're trying to fill the science gap there. There's a lot of investment in green infrastructure, but not a lot of science to provide that priority. So that's something we're doing now. And this is a review I did now 2 years ago with my student Anthony Ayres, who's focusing his PhD on this kind of questions, looking at the role of urbanization on bee declines. And so we know that there's a wide variety of natural histories of bees. Some are specialists on few flowers, some are generalists with a broader dietary breadth. They come in all shapes and sizes, large and small. Some are early season, some are late, some are ground nesting, some are cavity nesting, right? There's just this natural diversity. But through the literature, this is globally, there's more studies, of course, in Europe, but there are now a growing literature in North America. And overall, we're seeing the urban environment is really filtering out a lot of the wild bee community. So while there's a lot of diversity in naturalized areas and even agricultural landscapes, urban landscapes tend to have a reduced diversity of bees. We only seem to see the generalists, small-bodied, late emerging, and cavity nesting. Maybe not surprising, we're losing some of the ground nesting bees given the paved impervious surface. And so understanding this effect urbanization is having on bees and how to offset that is vital moving forward. So some of the work we're doing is combining our traditional plant pollinator natural history approaches, but also using current molecular tools, using genomic tools to understand bee population densities. So here's a map of the GTA. The densely urban areas are in red, the more agricultural landscapes across the green belt in orange, and then there's forested patches in green. We sampled over 180 sites across this landscape and collected these specimens for whole genome sequencing so we can look at the population genetics of the bee as well as their environmental DNA and microbiome. And we can, on the bottom, use these data to look at species distribution maps. The really red areas are high connectivity, high gene flow regions. and the other areas have low diversity and low connectivity. So we can see throughout the green belt, a really good areas for bees, high connectivity, high gene flow. And then there's a lot of patchy areas where there's heavily fragmentation, not a lot of green space. And so there's less corridors for bees. And so we're hoping to use this data to kind of highlight these areas of low flow for possible restoration and conservation efforts. So we can characterize the land use looking at percent development is really just how much impervious surface or asphalt and concrete is in an area. And it ranges dramatically across the GTA. Likewise, green space, there are some really nice, beautiful green spaces like High Park, we love that place, but there's a whole lot of nothing in between sometimes. And so we can characterize the green space as well. Interestingly, urban landscapes have an effect called the urban heat island effect. And so within the urban center, it tends to be about 5 degrees warmer than the outlying area. It also affects precipitation, whereby the really hot areas tend to be low moisture. And so it's really changing the ecology of that landscape dramatically. And so we're detecting that through our surveys as well. And so collecting across such a wide range, we're able to use genomic tools to look at bacteria, fungi, nematodes, plants, protists, and even viruses in the landscape to really get a holistic approach, understanding what's going on across the GTA. One thing we're finding is that in these really high development areas, development 5 being pretty well impervious surface, low green, very little green space, high temperatures and moderate precipitation. We're seeing a really high abundance of plant pathogens, a really high abundance of bee pathogens. Overall, it seems like these really high urban areas may be pathogen hotspots, so potentially really of concern. So if we can provide a little more green space, break up some of these really high urban areas, it might alleviate some of this kind of disease transmission. We're aware of that more than ever these days. So overall, it's a big problem. It's a big approach, but understanding fundamentally the biodiversity in our backyard is vital if we want to preserve it moving forward. Regional surveys, regional records, plant pollinator networks, well, very basic biology are vital if we want to do anything else moving forward. We can contribute to some of the conservation action. If we can detect some of these rare endangered species, it helps government officials and policy moving forward and understand regional faunas. Again, just a lot of documentation needs to happen. But it's also a win for science communication and outreach. I think a recent National Geographic survey showed that bees are actually the #1 species world over that people want to conserve more than the polar bears, the sharks, or anything else. So there is a huge public interest. I could give this talk every day. I thank God for YouTube and other venues because the public interest, and that's why these things like Pollinate.to exist. People want to do right by bees. They just need the science. There is the resources. We just need the science to make it as beneficial as it can be. So with that, I'd like to thank my students and collaborators as well as funding sources, without which this wouldn't be possible. And I'd like to thank you very much for inviting me. It's a pleasure being here today, and I'll take any questions.